Hi, Morgan. It's so nice to speak with you about this movie, Roadrunner, about Anthony Bourdain. I really appreciate your being here with us today and talking about this movie, which I think is both really joyous and sad to watch because we're conscious through the whole movie that this isn't going to be a happy ending, as the movie states clearly. Bourdain died by suicide 3 years ago. And I think for the viewer and also for the people who appear in the movie, it feels very recent. I think we're all still processing it. So I guess I just wanted to ask you, how do you deal with death in this movie while also making it sort of very much about the subject's life?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I started shooting the film maybe 16 months after he had died, and then we shot it for about a year. So even during the course of me shooting the film, I felt like people's relationships with their own grief was changing, and that I saw every stage of grief along the way. And it was hard. I think in a way, actually, me stepping in to do the film, I became kind of the group therapist in a way for many of these people, because I was kind of giving them permission to tell me everything they thought and felt about what had happened. And many people told me they hadn't really even talked to their loved ones about these things, just because often in the wake of a suicide, people don't really feel like they have permission to talk about those things. So at the same time, I really didn't want the film to feel eulogistic, like it's all seen through the prism of this heavy death. And so when we actually started editing the film, my editor, Eileen Meyer, and I started at the beginning of the film. And I said, let's not look at any of the interviews that talk about the end of his life or think about it for the next 4 or 5 months. And so for the whole first 4 or 5 months, we cut the first half of the film, which is really a great ride. It's somebody in their mid-40s who has this unexpected success and is suddenly able to travel the world. And there was so much footage to support that story. And it was just, I wanted it to feel like you didn't know how the story was going to end. And that was important to me, and I feel like we succeeded in doing that. And then it was a matter of how do you bridge Tony at the beginning of the story with Tony at the end of the story, and how does the tone shift through the entire film?
Right. I feel like the film did give such a sense of his trajectory, the early scenes, and it really portrays him as a chef and a rebel and an addict. And then you see him, he writes his book, Kitchen Confidential, that was a huge hit. That is probably how many of us first became his fans. And it learned, when not to order fish in a restaurant, which I don't think necessarily pertains anymore. But, and you sort of see him come into this moment of fame, and he's so like bashful and surprised in the archival footage. And it just really, I think it does give a really good sense of him as he develops as a person, and how much he sort of never really loses that early like surprise and bashfulness, and like, how did I wind up here?
100%. I mean, I was talking to a well-known writer who said she met Tony in 2000, because both their first books were published that year, and they were on the book tour circuit. They were at a book festival, and they met each other, and they were saying to each other, can you believe it? People are standing in line to get us to sign our books. And, how exciting is this? And she said she ran into him in 2016 at another book festival. And he came up to her and said, can you believe it? They're still buying our books. And she said, yeah, actually, I can't believe it, because we're good writers. But for Tony, I think he always felt like he was getting away with something, and that if he didn't keep going, it was all going to disappear. And he had imposter syndrome. Many people told me that, this feeling that, he had to be grateful for what he had. And I think it's part of what motivated him to keep going and doing as much as he did. But it also was the thing that made him restless, and that I think he kind of willfully put on blinders to understanding how good he was, how important he was, what he meant to people. And even in the people who work with him, say on his TV show, and people, you know, in his universe, every one of them was utterly shocked by how far and wide and deep the reaction was to his death. And I think that's because Tony really liked to keep a bubble around him and his team and his world, and kind of not feel like they had the responsibility of being that important. You know, I think there was something that Tony liked about always feeling a little desperate and a little like I have to hustle, you know, that I can't just take time off, you know, and he had fantasies of taking time off, and he even had a book contract to go, you know, live in Vietnam for a year and write a book about it, or to do fewer shows and all of these things. And he never did them. He never did one less show any season over all those years of making the show. So it's something that I think was both kind of something at times it was an attribute and times was an anchor, you know, and I think that's true of so many things in his life. You know, some of his greatest qualities were also his greatest weaknesses.
Yeah, yeah, it was just that like relentless pursuit of the real. You know, and you saw how devoted he was to excellence and perfection, you know, this ideal that no one can ever really attain. I was thinking about, you know, the people that you make movies about, like everyone from Mr. Rogers to Leonard Cohen, and you know, it's such a diverse group. And yet there sort of is like this uniting thing of like people who are outsiders and people who are really searching for like truth and depth in their life experience. I don't know. I just wanted to ask you, what drew you to Bourdain specifically?
I mean, it took me 20 years of making movies to kind of figure out what I make movies about. And I think looking back, I said, oh, I guess I make movies about culture. You know, a lot of it is biography and characters that I'm attracted to. But what I'm attracted to is culture, and culture in like the broadest meaning that culture, yes, is art and film and music. And I've made films about that. But it's also food and clothing and really how we perceive other people and how we perceive ourselves. It's what identity is based on. And that's the same stuff that Tony was always trading in his show. So in that way, I felt like we were on a similar mission. And I think it's part of what attracted me to want to tell the story. That, and, you know, my other big food connection is I created the show Ugly Delicious with David Chang. And when we first started talking about making that show in 2015, Chang said, oh, I have to go get the blessing of Uncle Tony. And, you know, Uncle Tony had helped support Lucky Peach magazine, and he had an imprint where he was publishing books by Chris Ying, another one of the founders of Lucky Peach, and kind of really being the godfather of the alternative food media scene over those decades, you know, from 2000 on. And Tony gave Chang the blessing to go ahead and do our show. But that kind of gave me a window into how important he was to all of these people who were my friends. So in a secondhand way, I had a sense of his influence beyond just what I saw on television or I'd read.
Right, and that's sort of like the overlap in your world as David Chang comes into this movie at one point, and I really want to talk about food, but you know, I was thinking while you were talking about sort of that alternative media sense of things, and how it's interesting because Bourdain, you know, toward the end he became involved with the Italian actress Aja Argento, and was really vocal about the Me Too movement. And I think there have been a lot of sort of alternative food world Me Too movement moments where top chefs have, you know, been accused of various kinds of bad behavior. And I just can't help but thinking, you know, how interesting it would be to see how he would have navigated that, and what continued role he would have had, and how he might have been a voice during these kinds of reckonings, as the food world sort of tries to make workplace behavior,
Sure.
more, yeah.
I mean, I think, I think of it in kind of two parts. There's the Me Too part, which of course there are people who have exhibited terrible behavior and people who've been kind of, you know, taken to task, rightfully so, for what they've done to female employees and others. And Tony, as we show in the film, very much what led the charge on that. He also really went out of his way to do kind of a massive mea culpa for Kitchen Confidential, saying that it was kind of a, a bro how-to guide of being a rock and roll chef. And the funny thing is, I went back and reread the book specifically with that in mind. And though the book may have been read that way, the book itself has nothing but respect for women. And I think Tony always did. Tony was personally, Tony was always in, monogamous relationships. He was married to his high school sweetheart and in love with her throughout that entire time he was in the kitchen. But I think, and he had respect for strong women, but I think the book became something that people interpreted differently. In other words, I feel like the book in some ways he thought of as a cautionary tale and people saw it as a how-to manual. So
yeah. Yeah.
And that the flip side of it is just in general, kind of the other reckoning, which I think is just starting to happen, which is just about behavior, abusive behavior in the workplace, particularly in kitchens. And, Tony absolutely had that. What's interesting is that Tony ran his kitchen and he was really, why he got so much work as a chef was that he was really good at running an efficient kitchen. And he always talked about it as the metaphor of the pirate ship, that, you are tough on the people to work with you, but you are fiercely loyal and they're loyal to you. And it's you against the world. And there's not a lot of praise in the kitchen. And that's how he was brought up and that's how he ran the kitchen. And when he left the kitchen, that's how he ran his TV show. That's how he treated the people that worked with him for years on the show. And they stuck with him and they loved him because they understood that he was being tough, but he was being tougher on himself. And I think that DNA of how he ran his show was a direct result of how he ran his kitchens. But even, in this day and age, I think all of that is changing more and more, and rightfully so.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's talk about food. It's not really a food movie, but there's a lot of food in it. And it all, so, how did you think about the food angle as you were going about this?
What's interesting, because part of the story is that Tony starts as kind of a food personality, TV food personality, which would have been, a label he would have despised. But, his first show, Cook's Tour, was done for the Food Channel. I think they told him there had to be food in every single scene. And if they would do a scene that didn't have food in it, they'd say, you have to cut that scene out. So, by the time he got to the Travel Channel for No Reservations for many years, he had to have food in half the scenes. I think was kind of the rule of thumb for them.
The stipulation.
Yeah, the stipulation, yeah. So there had to be a lot of food. And then when you got to CNN, it was kind of like, okay, just do whatever you want. And so in a way, food became less important because I always feel like for him, food was a Trojan horse, And when I think about what he did with food, it's something that it's so related to what I like about telling stories about people and what we tried to do with Ugly Delicious, which is, food is a way of talking about culture and people. And I think Tony, what's interesting is, he went to CIA, the Culinary Institute of America. He understood kind of old school French technique. He could be great friends with people like Eric Repair and could appreciate what it took to do that level of cooking. At the same time, he was somebody who really kind of opened the door on the, the inverted importance of food. and understanding that street food could be just as important as Michelin star food, and that the stories and the people who make that food are just as valid and in some ways even more worthy of celebrating. So I feel like this revolution that's happened in how we perceive food over the last 20 years is something that he was right at the forefront of. And I think that's something that never left him, and I think this idea that people travel to go eat in street carts in India now, rather than, going to Paris to the finest restaurants. I mean, you can do both. I mean, I think it's kind of his point, and I like that, the high low of Tony, that, that's something I really connected with, this idea that he could appreciate the finest things in food, but also, the simplest things.
Right. Yeah, he had a really good sense of balance that way. Excellence by its own bar kind of thing. And I think it does really sort of predate the moment that we're having now, where with Black Lives Matter, we've been talking more about what kind of restaurants get coverage, and being more equitable, and in what kind of restaurants get featured in food media. And he really was such an early adopter of that kind of thinking, but it just came so naturally to him, because it was so human. And I thought it was really interesting to see the evolution in Roadrunner, because in the beginning, you show how not only did he have to have food in every scene, but it had to be like shocking food. Like part of the early conceit of the shows was that he was going to eat quote unquote gross things, like a snake's beating a heart that had just been like ripped from its body. Spoiler alert. Sorry. And, and sort of how he evolves. And at one point, there were some scenes where he started, he was in Beirut and got caught in a conflict there. There was a moment where I think in some ways, maybe he was always politicized, but he became a little bit more overtly politicized. And he says something like, I thought that food was this great uniter. The table was where we all came together, no matter who we were, what culture, where we're from. And now I'm really starting to worry that that's not the case, because he was starting to see what it was to not have food, or to be in places where it wasn't so easy. I don't know. I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that scene and that transition for him.
Sure. I mean, that was a Beirut episode he did in 2006, where he got caught up in a war. And to people working with Tony, they talked about that scene being pivotal in terms of a lot of things. In terms of how he thought about what the TV show could be, how he thought about trying to sum things up and make everything sound rosy, he just kind of stopped at that point. And understanding his privilege, which I think he was always out ahead of, for, a white man traveling the globe. I think he was the first person to constantly be trying to elevate voices around him and not himself. And he talked about that, at great length. And even though he wasn't necessarily political, the one issue he really did speak out about consistently was immigration. Mainly because the kitchens he worked in for 25 years were staffed by the hardest working people that he respected more than anybody, who were, for the most part, immigrants from Central America and sometimes South America. And so that sense of, these are the people who actually feed us and we are not respecting them. Those, this is how the entire industry works. And I think there's a lot of denial in America about those things, that Tony was always really willing to hold people's, feet to the fire over. And that's something I so respect him for doing.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you before we run out of time about the movie's name, which I think has particular resonance for the Massachusetts audience. It was Roadrunner. The song was once pitched to become the state song of Massachusetts, although I don't think anything actually ever came of it. But why, why that song and why that name?
Well, it's, Tony, he lived in Massachusetts And we have clips of him in Provincetown where he would spend his summers through college and then after college. And it's where he first started working in kitchens. And he did an episode of Parts Unknown where he goes back and visits it. And we had all this raw footage of him kind of walking around in front of the house he used to rent, where he lived and worked in the kitchen. And he was incredibly fond of it, of those days and his memories of Massachusetts. He also loved the Modern Lovers, Jonathan Richman, the Modern Lovers. And that song, before we even made the film, I went through and found every song he ever mentioned anywhere. He had put together playlists and podcasts and his books and the footage. And I put together a playlist that was about almost 19 hours long. And I shared it with everybody working on the film, and ROADRUNNER was on it. And it was just one of those things where I listened to it and I said, you know what? We should have started the film with this song, and I should call the movie ROADRUNNER. It was like one of those initial ideas that you're like, okay, well, I'll come up with something better later. And as we made the film, we experimented and tried in different things, 50 different ways. And ROADRUNNER just stuck, and I love it. I've always loved that song, but I love
It's a great song.
the energy
There's a lot
of
of
it.
really good music in this movie, in addition to a scene with Iggy Pop, which is very worth watching, and I will not say more about it at this time. So I guess my last question for you is, I felt like this is a movie about Tony Bourdain, but it's about so much more thematically. And I guess I wondered, what do you hope the audience will take away from it? What do you hope they'll keep thinking about it after the credits roll?
I mean, I think to me, there are two big takeaways. There's the external and the internal. The external takeaway is the stuff that attracted me to Tony all along, that here's somebody who's the ambassador of curiosity, the champion for having an open mind. And that's just so important, and something that part of why I think he connected with people is, and he says it in the film, that, going to a place and being shocked or surprised by what he finds was his favorite thing, to not just try and validate his preconceptions. So being open-minded and curious and traveling and having a passport and all those things, and kind of what travel does to you and what you bring home with travel, that which is kind of obvious, but still always necessary. And then the internal thing, which is just how we come to terms with depression and mental health issues. And, I think that the takeaway is for us to have sympathy and understanding, and try to understand that the people who may seem like they're okay often aren't. I mean, it's Tony's relationship with his own kind of depression was something he masked behind humor. He joked all the time about it. And I think just understanding that it's okay to give permission to people to be open and vulnerable. I mean, even this film has unlocked a lot of conversation in just about suicide, which wasn't the first thing I thought when I thought about making this film, but I'm so happy it's happening, because there are things that if we don't talk about them, we just bottle them up, they can fester. And I think it's good just to get everything out in the open as much as you can.
Yeah, that's really lovely. Thank you so much, Morgan Neville, for taking the time to speak, and thank you for sharing ROADRUNNER with us.
Great talking to you.
Likewise.